I have been the chair of the Environmental Council for 4 years, and I can tell you, I accumulated a lot of frustration, and it led me to want to research, why is nobody listening? And that's the talk about today. So I'm just gonna move this a little bit here. So you've heard it on the news, it's been all over the place. It was predicted that we are gonna reach the Earth's tipping point, and we have reached it. We've gone past it. We have gone past the 1.5 degrees already. And we know what we need to do. We know what we should have done. We didn't do it. It's too late. We have talked about adaptation. And I'm just asking, why are people not listening? Why are we know what to do. Many of these things that we should do are easy to do. We're just not doing them. So why are people not listening? Why are we not acting? Why didn't we act? Why are we not acting now? And my question is, are we doing enough to make people listen, to make people act? Are we doing it right? And that leads me to the psychology of climate change communication. And to begin with, when we communicate about climate change to people, we need to consider individual barriers, both from a general perspective and from a psychological perspective. I'm first gonna introduce the general barriers, and then I'm gonna show you some approaches to solve this issue. To spoil it a bit, so far, there were a lot of trial and errors, and none worked, but there is hope. So what are these individual barriers? We all know it. There is a lack of knowledge. There are people who just simply don't know that there is climate change, that it's happening. And in this room, it might sound unbelievable, but there are still people who go like, what, climate change? Okay, this proportion of people is shrinking. But the proportion of people who are uncertain and skeptical about climate change, they are still massive. They are there. And of course, if we are not believing in climate change, we are not going to act on it. Related to this is a distrust in information. If you talk to people who are climate change deniers, they distrust the information that you present to them because they might not be scientific literate, they might not know what is a reliable source, what not. Once people accept the fact of climate change, they might still face the barrier of externalizing responsibility. Why should I act if the billionaires go with their private jet to the next meeting or to Greenland? Also, another barrier is a reliance on technology. Yeah, I would walk, but I like to use my car. There are also other priorities. Yeah, I would reduce my CO2 footprint, but I like to go to Tenerife every year. Related to these other priorities is also the lifestyle. Yeah, I could have an electric car, but the kind of car that I like is just not electric. And related to that lifestyle issue is the personal freedom. Like, oh, I gonna decide when I go on holiday and where I go on holiday. And I decide what kind of car I drive, and I decide whether I go by car or by bus. And last but not least, people have economic concerns regarding their income and the costs. Especially the people with a lower income are skeptical towards governments implementing climate change mitigation and adaptation measures because they might suffer from additional taxes or just costs that affect their already very tight budget. And yeah, also personal costs are an issue. Not everyone can afford now switching to an electric car, and the bus might not be an option, especially here in Iceland. If you live remotely somewhere on a farm, there is just no bus. Okay, now moving to my field of expertise, the psychology. Psychological individual barriers that have been researched a lot are psychological distancing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Then this group of barriers, psychological faulty mental models and poor judgment or psychological bias. These are just, you can think of it, wrong logic when listening to facts, just appraising them in the wrong way, perceiving something that is bigger as actually smaller. This factors in a lot when we talk about the CO2 footprint, and people say, oh, but I recycle my waste, which has a very small effect, but then they go with their airplane to, yeah. And the last two groups, they are also psychologically related to a depressive attitude or a depressive vulnerability. It's fatalism and helplessness. Oh, it's just gonna happen. I cannot do anything about it. Yeah, this is a little bit of a passive perspective from affected individuals. Also related to that are socio-demographic factors, and I think you know them already. I'm just summarizing them. In general, women are more likely to show environmental involvement. Now, I'm speaking to all the men here. Thank you for being here. These are the statistics. When we count the involved researchers, the women are overrepresented, so we need more men in this field. And age is an important factor, but it's not linearly related to pro-climate behavior. It depends on the type of the behavior, on the cohort, and on education. So regarding the type of behavior, we have, for example, younger people being more willing to switch to the bus, public transport, car sharing, walking, biking, whereas the cohort which has the money to buy an electric car might buy that, or who has the money to change all the lights in the house to costly LEDs might do that. And then last but not least, and we see that everywhere, education, which is kind of correlated with age, education also plays an important role. Higher education predicts greater pro-climate engagement. So when we think about barriers to university education, numerus clausus, and so on, actually, in terms of climate change, we should just let everybody into university to increase the broad level of education. Okay, now let's go into some details how to address these barriers. So first of all, knowledge. Of course, we want people to know. That means we need to communicate. But even more effective than knowing that climate change is here is experiencing it. Of course, we have to pair the experience with the information that where does it come from. There are numerous studies that examine the climate change skepticism or climate change belief before and after climate change disasters, floods, hurricanes, heat waves. And personal experience facilitates the acceptance of the scientific fact of climate change. That has been shown everywhere in the world, specifically in America, where we often look regarding these climate change communication studies. However, when we look at knowledge and attitudes, knowledge about the causes of global warming enhances the willingness to address climate change. So far, so good. But this public awareness and concern is in strong disparity with this limited behavioral response. And we call it this attitude behavior gap. People know, people are worried, but they don't do anything. That's why we're here today. That's why we are talking about this. How can we bridge that? How can we make people who are worried actually act? Important to know is that this is not a one-way direction. First of all, when people know and believe in climate change or are worried, they might change back to being more skeptical. They might change back to being less worried because other things get more important. So these opinions and attitudes and beliefs and the knowledge, they change over time, both towards greater acceptance and increased behavioral willingness, but also towards denial and opposition. And the question is why? And here psychology can give a great deal of a response. And one big factor is memory. Psychological research on memory for climate change facts and knowledge shows that these positive effects of climate change messages, if they're there, they decay over time. They don't decay completely. It's not like everything is gone after a month, but depending on the recipient of the message, depending on the timing, and depending on how the message was framed, people might forget about it, might find other things more important, and might selectively recollect only part of the story that you told them. So it's really important to package the message such that it sticks. Another aspect when communicating climate change that was heavily researched, and I think this took up much too much attention of researchers over time, is the psychological distancing that I mentioned already earlier. This goes back to this construal level theory, which says, okay, in order for people to act, in order to overcome this attitude behavior gap, we need to reduce the psychological distance in space, social dimension, and in the temporal dimension. So we need people to know climate change is not happening somewhere else. It's happening here. It's not happening to someone else. It's happening to you. And it's not happening in the future. It's happening now. And people did a great deal of research and were like, oh yeah, this is how to do it. But in the end, the research shows this is not working for climate change. This is working for other topics, but for climate change, this idea of psychological proximizing doesn't work. And the question is why? It's quite frustrating after all the research on psychological proximizing that we are there back at the beginning. And yeah, we are now there to try to find out why. One possible answer is the emotion. And this is another big movement in psychological climate change messaging. Should the message be negative or should the message be positive? We have been communicating about this polar bear on the melting ice for years. And then researchers said, no more polar bears on melting ice, because this is a negative message. We should rather present a positive picture of an alternative future, because that captures attention more effectively, polarizes less. Yes, that's true. I think I heard a lot in the poster that you presented. And it motivates pro-climate behavior better than provoking fear. Is that true? I went deep into the literature on emotional framings for climate change messages, because that's my expertise, memory and emotion. And to spoil it all, it's not that simple. It's not positive or negative. It's not this or that emotion. Let's look a little bit on that. In general, emotions play a key role in climate change messaging. They energize and inhibit actions. But the research is contradicting a lot in terms of which emotions you should trigger. And I might have an answer at the end of the presentation to that. So first of all, some researchers suggest that emotions that energize climate action are negative self-conscious emotions, for example, shame and guilt. They are supposed to increase motivation to repair the situation. But it's not working for everyone. Some people, when you shame them, they are just then very opposite and don't listen to you anymore. Another emotion that was suggested to energize climate action is climate anxiety, which can be good, especially in terms of memory. Anxiety leads to a better recall of information. You remember situations in which you were anxious about something, in which you were afraid, a lot better than neutral situations. But climate anxiety can also be paralyzing if it's overwhelming. And research from Australia suggests that eco-anger is the best emotion that you can trigger in most people. I am very responsive to eco-anger by myself. And that's why I needed a break from the Environmental Council. I was just too eco-angry all the time. Eco-anger is most effectively leading to actions, according to the, not just me, single case study, but according to large-scale research in Australia and elsewhere. However, there is also research which says basic emotions in general lead to distancing from climate change threat. And all these emotions that I mentioned now are basic emotions. So in some people, when you trigger emotions, they might just go on distance. They say, oh, it's not so, it's not me, it's not, because the emotions are overwhelming. So there is quite some contradiction in research. But what we know for sure is climate depression that leads to avoidance and low levels of perceived control. I've mentioned this helplessness, hopelessness earlier. Climate depression, grief definitely doesn't lead to action. So we don't want to make people sad. That's not going to work. So the truth is somewhere in between. And the most probable answer is to which message we are most responsive is, first of all, not static. It changes over time. You are responsive to a different message today than next month. And second, there is not this one size fits it all solution. Some people respond better to a positive message, and some people get going when they get angry. And this leads us to the concept of micro-targeting, which is, I think, the hype now in psychological climate change communication. In America, they have this model of the 5 groups of recipients. They range from the climate change deniers to the extremely worried people. And you can take a test on their website. And I guess all of us are in the extremely worried and concerned and the active people section. And they created messages for each of these groups. And the targeted message for each of these groups, they look very different. And also they take into account limitations in terms of knowledge, belief. They try to minimize polarization. And the good message of the day that this approach reaches even Republicans. So to name one group of recipients which are very, very resistant to climate change communication. So at the moment, scientists believe that micro-targeting is the future. We are going to see whether that's still what we believe in, I don't know, 3 years from now. But I think I can close with this good message. So we do not go out here climate change depressed, but climate change positive and angry, hopefully. Thank you very much.